Be co-facilitating our panel with Dr. Araba Say. He might give us a wave now. Dr. Say is a principal research scientist at the University of Washington Information School and a research associate of Research ICT Africa. Her work aims to understand different factors underlying types of digital inequality and ways to foster diversity and inclusion. And she has extensive experience in international research projects on topics ranging from technology entrepreneurship to gender digital equality. Before I introduce the panelists who will be joining Araba and I for our event today, let me briefly introduce our panel. Today, our focus is on co-designing the decade for equitable outcomes. This one-hour panel event is hosted by the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center at the University of Washington Earth Lab as part of the Ocean Voices Decade Action and our commitment to advance equity through the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Now, co-design is a term that's increasingly used in the context of the decade and more broadly. But is there a common understanding of what this term means, how it happens in practice, and what the link is to equity? Our panelists will explore these questions in addition to sharing their perspectives to how co-design challenges might be addressed in the decade today. Most of our panelists are going to be sharing perspectives as researchers. And as I'll mention at the end of our event, this is part of a larger initiative to provide platforms that enable us all to listen to diverse perspectives. And we hope that you'll continue to join us in this initiative. So let me now turn to introduce our 5 wonderful panelists who will be sharing their perspectives today. Starting with Dr. Heike Bodwich, who might give us a wave on the thing. Heike is a postdoctoral fellow with marine affairs at Dalhousie University, where her work examines how environmental governance can advance justice with a particular focus on Indigenous fishery development. She's currently working with Inuit youth and leaders in the Canadian Arctic to explore how Indigenous scientist knowledge co-production initiatives can support Inuit-led marine spatial planning. Our panel is also very happy to have Dr. Elisa Morgera with us today. Dr. Morgera is Professor of Global Environmental Law at the University of Strathclyde Law School in the UK and member of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance. She specialises in international biodiversity law and its linkages with human rights, notably the rights of Indigenous peoples and small-scale fishing communities, everyone's right to health and science, and business responsibility to respect human rights. In addition, we have Dr. Annette Powellison. Hi, Annette. Annette is an assistant professor in the environmental policy group of Wageningen University. Her research weaves together critical social theory with ethnography of human-ocean relations and conservation practices, focusing in particular on Southeast Asia and Northern Europe. We're also joined by Dr. Gerald Singh today. Hey, Gerald. Gerald is the Deputy Science Director of the Ocean Nexus Center at Memorial University in Canada. His research is primarily situated at the science policy interface and focused on understanding dynamics between social, economic, and environmental dimensions in sustainable development. He navigates data gaps and uses a combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches, as well as structured expert elicitation in his work. And last, but by no means least, we have Dr. Anil Spalding on our panel today. Dr. Spalding is Associate Professor of Marine and Coastal Policy at Oregon State University and a Research Associate at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and the Research Center in Panama. Her current interdisciplinary research studies include adaptive capacity to ocean acidification in resource-dependent communities, science policy engagement, and work on the current state and future of Anthropocene ocean governance in relation to protected areas and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Having introduced the 5 wonderful panelists who will be joining Araba and I for the conversation today, let me turn to a few housekeeping remarks before handing it over to Araba. Please note that this webinar is being recorded today so that we can continue to refer to it in future discussions. We're also going to be using some polls so that you can share your thoughts on the 4 questions that we'll be exploring on our panel today. All the responses to this will be anonymous, and you can provide multiple responses. And we'll be seeing the response that you provided to each of the questions as we progress through our panel discussion. And finally, if there are questions that you'd like to pose to the panel, please put them in the Q&A box on the webinar that you can see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pose them to the panelists as much as we're able to. On that note, I'd like to hand over to Araba, please, to begin our panel discussion. Araba, over to you. And
Thank you, Harriet.
Yeah.
Yes. and welcome again to our lovely panelists. We'd like to kick this off by reflecting a little bit on one of the key concepts in our topic today, co-design. So our question for all our panelists is this: what does co-design mean to you or the projects you're working on? And while our panelists are answering this question, to our audience, you'll have a poll in the chat asking you the very same question. So please go over, answer that question while you're listening to our panelists' responses. So now we'll just throw that question open to anyone who wants to go first. What does co-design mean to you and or the project you're working on? Shall we start maybe with Anna?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Thank you, Araba. Thanks, everyone. And thank you. I'm excited to be here with this excellent panel. So co-design, I certainly think it can mean lots of things. I'm looking forward to seeing the poll results. For me specifically, it means working with a variety of groups on a shared goal. And so in the context, I'm going to speak specifically in the context of a project that's funded by multiple different agencies, both philanthropy, state agencies, and a federal agency here in the United States, that works on vulnerability to ocean acidification along the US West Coast. And so for us, in that context of that project, co-design means working as an interdisciplinary team of scientists, and it's truly interdisciplinary. We have a sort of a climate change, ocean science lead PI, we have a marine ecologist, and then myself as a social science policy person, human dimension. It also means working with stakeholders, so those who are directly affected by the issue. In the case of this vulnerability, we're focusing primarily on shellfish farmers in California and Oregon. So the stakeholders are the folks who are affected by that issue. We're also currently exploring formal relationships with coastal tribes in Oregon and Northern California. So those are also parts of what we would call rights holders, right? Folks who have a more direct right to the resource. We also include what we call end users, so those who are making decisions about the issue. And then our growing group of postdocs and students, which, as we like to say from the sort of lead PI position, are really doing the work and taking it in really exciting new directions. So that is a key part of the co-design, in that we're not being prescriptive in what kinds of research and the questions that we're asking. We have this really excellent team of students and postdocs and grad students thinking about where to take it. And of course, our donors, as I said, or funders of the work. We have a federal agency, we have a state agency, and we also have a philanthropy that is funding this work, which makes it really interesting and really exciting as well to try to meet the demands or interests, not demands, interests of these different groups. We've been really lucky to have a series of funders who are open to this process of proposing an idea. So we came up with the idea: how do we understand adaptive capacity or adaptation to climate change? That was sort of the big general concept. And then we have advisory boards in pretty much all the projects. We have an advisory board that provides input into that goal, into those questions. And then our team of PIs and students, as I said, is really flexible. We're really excited about the project, and we're willing to change project design within certain boundaries, of course, willing to change project design and come up with new innovative questions that really reflect the interests of our partners on the ground.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Anna. Shall we hear from Hekia now?
Sure. So I'm part of a project right now that is an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary initiative to advance knowledge co-production with scientists who are based at various institutions around Canada and Inuit groups up in the Arctic. And I guess in terms of what co-design means to the project, or what it means in this case, is that it's in part been an initiative to address existing inequalities that individuals on the ground have perceived in terms of how science being conducted in the Arctic and in the area, Nunavut specifically, has been conducted. So I think in some ways this is a bit unique to the Arctic context, in that governments have funded a lot of researchers to go up to the Arctic because there's major political economic implications associated with shipping and oil and fisheries up there, among other resources, mining, and researchers have been funded to go up there and often do studies to talk about what the ecology of this landscape looks like, and then leave. So community members that we're collaborating with, or the Nunavut government specifically who we're collaborating with, was very interested in not having that happen anymore, and to have research that was being done that was more directed by community interest, and then also was potentially, the results were going to stay in the community and benefit the community. As the project's unfolded, I think there's another goal within it, in that co-design is an initiative to help inform Inuit-led planning governance initiatives, both in terms of efforts to govern their own territory to which they have rights to already, how they should govern their own practices within these territories, but then also the ways in which the Inuit who are involved in various governing initiatives are able to speak to government officials about how governing should happen going forward. So specifically, we were talking this morning as part of the group about sea ice melting and shipping channels opening. And it's not always clear, what the implications of dumping from ships are going to be, because it's not always, clear without further analysis at this stage of where, these new currents are going to shift to, and where debris is going to be washed up on shore. So being able to hear from community that, that is a potential concern, and that if we have data going into these conversations with various organizations that govern shipping, we might be able to produce different outcomes. So co-design in this project has really been a process of trying to figure out what it is that community wants, and then how to ask a research question that aligns with that, given the skill sets that various individuals have as scientists in various fields, that will help address those skill sets. So it's very much a methodological or a process with goals to achieve certain outcomes. And those outcomes, I think, are different than what you normally see in a scientific research project. What the long-term goals are: Inuit-led marine spatial planning and more equitable forms of science governance.
Great, thanks, Hekia. And in our next question, we're actually going to delve even more into the question of how co-design actually happens in practice. But Gerald, can you tell us what co-design means to you and or the project you're working on?
Yeah, thanks, Araba. And I'm actually really happy that we started with Hekia and Anna, people kind of in the field doing this kind of work. And for me, I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about co-design with Ocean Decade, it's specifically towards sustainable development. And I think just reflecting on what the other two have said, for me, I would summarize co-design kind of along at least three principles. The first being that it's quite context-based. So you have to know kind of the situation you're in. We're not about promoting generalized knowledge. It's not about fundamental research. The second is that it is very problem focused. So set in the context of sustainable development, there are issues we're contending with, and there's issues especially that ocean communities contend with, and we're trying to figure out what to do about it. And the third is, I think this is a really important one, it's science as service. So this is not a model of science that's intent to be just exploratory and furthering science as a discipline itself. And when I say science, I mean quite broad, to consider even humanities and social sciences in this. But it's research and science to address issues that people are facing, and it usually means people that the research community itself is not a part of. So for me, it often means entering a partnership, elevating the concerns and issues of the local community above the researcher interests themselves. So it is in service of a problem that coastal communities are dealing with. And I'm sure we're going to delve into this more in further questions. So I'm happy to kind of leave it there.
Lovely. Thank you, Gerald. Elisa and Annette, can you quickly share your views with us also, what co-design means to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think some of it will resonate with what colleagues have already explained. In the case of the One Ocean Hub, we're a global North, global South cooperation across marine and social sciences, the arts and law, working in inter and transdisciplinary ways. And so the first step was finding actually our common questions. We all came with questions that were clear in our own previous work, and then meeting and finding out where our questions intersected or where there were underlying shared interests that kind of brought together and allowed us to, I think, coalesce and work more closely together than we had before. And that meant also working with some of our longstanding partners, from UN organizations to coastal communities to NGOs, and understanding their knowledge gaps and questions and seeing how we could align. And maybe there's two aspects to that are quite interesting for us to reflect in terms of what co-design means. And it's understanding the knowledge needs, but also the constraints in furthering knowledge of different partners, and how then by creating or enforcing a partnerships, we can each contribute to addressing the constraints that another may have, but through that also realizing our own blind spots and how there may be knowledge where we thought there isn't, or there may be responses to questions we had just because we hadn't connected to other scientists or other knowledge holders. And so I think all these aspects make co-design a really enlightening and enriching process where each learns about more of what is out there, and equally how to do their work slightly differently to advance together with others.
Thank you, Elisa. And finally, Annette.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for organizing this lovely panel. And I think, yeah, my response would build on the previous ones. So let me see, I will focus, to keep it short, I will then focus mostly on the epistemic part of it. So yeah, for me, I think co-design in my work as I see it mostly as approach as this creation across differences, which can relate to knowledge co-production or co-designing a research project involving a process of boundary crossing between cultures, disciplines, epistemic traditions, or possibly also different understandings of the world, of reality. And yeah, this is what I also very much encountered myself doing anthropological research with sea people in Indonesia, but also more recently, closer to my home, working with all kinds of people involved in oyster bed restoration in the North Sea. And so, so I'm always interested in how when I look at, for example, sea people in Indonesia, how they were involved in reef conservation and restoration, how there were conflicts emerging there, not only about different interests in reefs, but also about different ways of knowing and valuing human reef relations and different ontologies and epistemologies involved. When I think about co-design for conservation planning, then for me it's important that it's not just about participation, but about the process of equitable, I would say, translation and collaboration, which means that such co-design needs to be on equal terms, where both parties take each other's not only needs seriously, but also each other's like propositions, in terms of epistemic traditions or understandings of reality that people bring to the table when they're engaging in knowledge co-production. So that doesn't mean that parties cannot agree with each other, but it means not taking one epistemology or worldview as a priori superior, which I think still too often happens when Western science is taken as a default frame to define marine problems and solutions, but it starts with the problems. So finally, I think then the co-design then also needs to be based on on an acknowledgement and also hopefully undoing of these more structural power differences, also including the colonial relations between science and lay or indigenous or situated knowledge practices.
So now we're going to see what our audiences thought about co-design. And we can see a lot of the similar concepts and ideas that our panelists have discussed here, focusing on needs, community, stakeholders, knowledge together, science, research, people, designing. So it's clear that I think we all have these common understandings of what goes into or is part of co-design. At the same time, seeing such a broad range of views also highlights the fact that there are so many different angles or different points of focus that co-design could relate to for different people. And so part of the purpose of this panel really is to see how we can come to a sense of what the core elements of co-design might be, and then what are the maybe supporting aspects of it. So we'll look at this more in our next question, where we want to get a little more practical. And this question, we'll start with Hekia's view on how co-design happens in practice. So are there particular tools, particular practices that you use for co-design in your research, or that you're aware of that are useful tools for doing co-design? And poll number 2 is going to be in the chat box now for the audience. What tools or practices do you know about that support co-design in practice?
So I have 2 examples of practices that I think have helped co-design. And I think, first of all, a big challenge is figuring out, okay, we want to do research that supports community interests or aligns with communities are interested in understanding. But what does community, like, how do we account for that? Like, how do we even know what that means? So 2 examples of initiatives that I've been a part of that I think have helped facilitate the identification of what community interests are one being up in Nunatsiavut in the Arctic, where the Nunatsiavut government has a research advisory council. And the Research Advisory Council is a group through which you have to submit all research proposals. Any research that's being done in Nunatsiavut territory has to go through an approval process with the Research Council. And the Research Council, part of the purpose of their evaluation of your proposal is to identify what other projects are happening in the area or have happened in the area that might be worth aligning with or collaborating with, or that could inform your data collection. So I think that's helpful to address the problem of people come in and do these small projects and leave after a couple of years, and there's not this longer term evaluation. So potentially overcoming some of the limitations associated with the fact that you have a researcher with a 2-year or master's student with several years, PhD students for several years available to do a project that's going to leave. How do you link with other research in the area? The Research Advisory Council that has funding, I believe, from the Land Claim Settlement Act. So this is an infrastructure support initiative that I think can facilitate that process of co-design. Another example, or another role that the Research Advisory Council plays in terms of identifying what community interests are, is that they do research tours in the community once every year to ask people in the community what they want and what they want researched. And what needs they see. So the Research Advisory Council can then go and inform scientists about what sort of projects we want done. The Nunavut government has also funded research to go and gather stories from people and accounts from people about what they want done. So these are all initiatives that are community led, or they're I don't know if community is the right word, they're led by the Indigenous government up there. And they have helped identify community goals. Another example, I've worked quite a bit in New Zealand as well, is through provisions in research granting proposals to have advisory councils that include Indigenous community members. So this is specific to New Zealand. You oftentimes or almost always have to describe why you are or not including Maori in your project. And if you're addressing Maori interests or claiming to, part of the way to do that is to make sure you have a Maori advisory board. And that board is often comprised of hard-hitting individuals who are well regarded as individuals who have a good sense on what various Maori interests might be. So having in both of these contexts, spokespeople from the community whose job it is to help inform research direction, I think is helpful in the co-design process.
Thank you, Hekia. Let's hear from Gerald now, especially on the issue of relationship between co-design and transdisciplinarity.
Thanks, Sarava. It's like you read my mind. I think so. I mean, it is worth thinking about what we mean for co-design, and it's easy to come across the term interdisciplinarity. We've actually already heard it in this panel so far, and I think it's actually worth differentiating the two, or at least thinking about co-design as a more specific subset of transdisciplinarity. If you look up transdisciplinarity, there's actually often a few different ways of defining that, but one common way is to think about doing research that transcends research disciplines to include even people outside of traditional academic or research practices. So including local resource users and including some of their kind of lived experience in knowledge creation and in research practices, things like that. But one thing that I think sets what we're talking, or at least what I think we're talking about when we're talking about co-design, is the explicit attention to power differentials. So oftentimes in transdisciplinary research, the focus is really on aligning or balancing the interests of the research community and the resource community. And if you take that too literally, it's easy to be a bit naive about balance, because you might think that you're coming to an issue as equal partners. But oftentimes in research settings, it's the research community that actually comes with the funding, for example, and so can have a much larger say in terms of what happens. So if you know, going back to the original question, how does co-design happen in practice? What happens a lot of the time is that a research community or some member of the research community will reach out to a resource-based community and say, hey, I'm interested in exploring this problem. Can you help me out? And so that's very different. So then, you know, there might be co-design and how that question is answered, but the resource community had very little, if no say in what the actual question is. So I don't see, and that's can be perfectly fine as a transdisciplinary approach, but I don't think that that's quite co-design and how we're thinking about it. And so when thinking about, you know, how does what we're talking about co-design happen in practice, I think it's worth thinking about the fact that determining problems and research questions can itself be a research practice. So just doing the research in what's an important question is worth it. It adds time to the process, but it will help enable that the research itself is salient and relevant. Also, it's probably worth really brushing up on different deliberative approaches to help kind of weigh out and think about different kinds of questions, because I think doing good co-design is not it doesn't require analytical tools to determine, you know, what's important. It's a deliberative process. So going through those processes is very, very important. And I've probably gone past my time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Gerald. Important topic, though. Let's see, Annette, can you share with us your experiences in doing co-design in practice?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about there's a lot of promising and productive practices and tools available, and also already experimented with to co-produce knowledge, co-design projects, and even policies. Also at my university, we work a lot with that, like gaming, visual methods, online methods, some good old qualitative methods that anthropologists have been working with for decades. But yes, I'm also involved in some boundary crossing and inter and transdisciplinary courses. And I was just also listening to what Gerald said. I think also that co-design practices and approaches also might require also more boundary crossing competencies and attitudes, and not just individually, but also at an institutional level. So yeah, sometimes I think that like we might have to rethink also some of the academic research competencies that are celebrated in science, in marine science, and yeah, also maybe learning a bit from the insights from feminist theory and approaches that that I think the main point is that we co-designing approaches really need this willingness and ability to listen, and basically listening, particularly to what is different, time to build relations across differences over longer periods of time, relationship of trust, which is often not possible in a rat race that science is today, but also really building capacity to reflect on biases and privileges, also that were the previous panelists also referred to. And yeah, I don't mean only reflection on one's own gender or race, but also seeing how Western science and also natural science in particular also takes a position of power and privilege in knowledge collaboration. And so we need to make that more explicit, also the politics involved in co-design. I think that's repeating also some of the previous points. And then maybe lastly, also willingness and capacity to embrace also some of the discomfort that comes with such deep reflection and boundary crossing between epistemic traditions, but or disciplines, but also the need for more humility and knowing also when to when to shut up and give room to other voices. So with that, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Annette. Really interesting. Now, Elisa, I understand you're doing some interesting work using arts and also focusing on human rights approaches. Can you share a little bit with us about that?
Thank you. And it's very much work that other colleagues are doing. And maybe just to build up on the point that was made about how co-design is relational, it's really also about different researchers understanding who may already have trusted relationships with coastal communities, coming also from maybe prior projects that didn't have to do with ocean science, and how they can allow other researchers who maybe work at a distance from these communities to learn from those relationships, not necessarily being involved or brought in, but in some cases having their capacities built to be able to relate to those knowledge and relationships. And equally, I think thinking about relationships that as researchers we have with decision makers, and thinking about the question of the science policy interface also in terms of potentially a co-design relationship where we understand what the needs are and we together identify questions for researchers that can support the decision making further down the line. And so I think with that, there are some relationship building comes natural to some of us, some is more sensitive and requires really all that we can learn, I think, particularly from social sciences and those that work in research ethics and really need to support other researchers who have not had the privilege and the opportunity to learn firsthand what that trusted relationship means and how it's built over time. But I think what many colleagues across the One Ocean Hub are experimenting, and some I think are on the call today, is using art-based approaches as a different way to open up the space for everybody to learn, to listen, to see things that maybe we're not able to see. And so other colleagues, particularly in South Africa, have been using participatory theater or storytelling through photography or actual telling of stories as a way for researchers, but also other colleagues to listen first, to learn to listen, to learn to see things that we don't normally see and that are actually relevant, relationships to the ocean, relevant questions around the ocean. And through that, open a space for joint analysis of those findings, for self-reflection, and for being able to reflect together on issues without pointing fingers at each other, but maybe being able to be immersed, have a shared experience through art that allows to empathize with other people's knowledge, views, and values, and be transformed through that experience and looking with, in a different light to your own research until now and where your research can go in the future. And that, we are trying to see how that engagement with the arts and the opening up of different ways of relating to each other through empathy can also have, a very tangible policy meaning, and that comes through human rights. And so using arts as a way to make research more responsible, more cognizant of the fact that communities' claims and interests are actually legally backed as human rights to food, to health, to livelihoods, to culture, for researchers to understand their role in supporting the protection of human rights, but also for lawyers to realize that maybe the ways in which we usually try and protect human rights through formal consultations, through environmental impact assessments, are actually usually not enough. And maybe we do need to work much more with artists and others to open up different ways in which those processes can be more meaningful, and where, while we appreciate and we learn about power differences, we also find a way to work across those power disparities and allow for voices to emerge and learning to happen. So this is all work in progress, but we're trying to capture the learning. And I think having the conversations like today, comparing notes is really essential, because it is an iterative process, and we keep learning and realizing how we could do things in a better, more respectful way as we go along.
Thank you, Elisa. And now, Anna, can you share with us your experience using co-design in practice? And also, if you can speak to, whether we are developing a better understanding of co-design compared to, the ideas about participatory research, user-centered research, and so on that have evolved over the last 50 plus years.
Thank you, Araba. So I'm going to borrow Gerald's approach of synthesizing, kind of trying to bring it together and say some of the key points, because everyone has basically said so many of the things. I would say, so in practice, I mean, I guess one of the core things is just thinking, right? It's empathy, compassion, respect, and listening. And as Elisa was just saying, recognizing the conditions that enable or not those who are participating in the process to be compassionate, empathic, and respectful, right? Because recognizing that there are certain human rights that allow or not people to engage in these ways. And I'm thinking from the community groups that we may work with, all the way through to our students and the conditions under which they're working, and that make it really hard for them to sort of be in this Zen space of, yes, let's just all engage and get along, right? I mean, there's some very real conditions under which it's hard for us to engage in these ways. The second piece I think is important that most folks mentioned was this idea of flexibility and innovation. And again, I'm really thinking of early career researchers. How can we support early career researchers, particularly folks that are less represented? And this is where a lot of this innovation is going to come from, in thinking about this concept of participation and engagement in research that's relevant. And the third piece I was going to say, so it's this continued engagement / commitment. And I struggle with this, again, because of the nature of the jobs that we have. We're constantly changing or moving to new institutions. And what does that mean for the type of engagement, right? It's very easy for us to say, yes, I'm committed. But then in practice, you move on to the next thing. It goes back to the conditions, right? The reasons why folks are moving around. But in that sense, I think it's really, really important for this co-design to be grounded in organizations that are based in place and that are based and will be there for a long time. So it's finding those key partners, even if, maybe the leadership changes in an environmental NGO, right? And so an example is I work with one of the oldest NGOs in Panama, where I'm from, is, how like that is a great place to fund, to support, to engage with, because they've been around for such a long time. They know a lot of these things. And then in terms of tools, there are lots of tools for this practice. One of the key ones that I can think of from a social science perspective is, IRBs and data agreements and bioethic committees. Flawed, depending on how institutions run it, based on all sorts of, some problematic issues. But overall, it's a check. It's one of the ways in which we can check ourselves, make sure that we're doing things, in some way that's respectful and accountable. And in terms of how it's changed from what we called participatory research, I don't know. I mean, it's just the next buzzword, right? And if we want to think about it as the next buzzword, I think it's less about the terminology and more about what we're actually doing, and what we're calling it in terms of what we're actually doing and how we're learning from what we did 10 years ago. I'd be happy to continue to call it participatory research as long as there's demonstrated learning and improvement and continued acknowledgement and humility in recognizing mistakes and commitment to moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Anna. And I think in the interest of time, we're going to combine our next two questions into one. But while we're setting up for the next question, Karine will share the results of poll number 2. Our next question then for panelists is, what is the link between co-design and equity? A lot of the conversations about participatory research, co-design, have been about involving more people. And so what is the link between co-design and equity? And are there perhaps instances where co-design might actually have the exact opposite effect of perpetuating inequalities and inequities? And considering that, how can these challenges be addressed in the decade? So what is the link between co-design and equity? And how can the challenges associated with co-design be addressed in the decade? And anyone who wants to go first can do so. And remember, audience, we're going to have both questions for you in the chat box as well.
I can start, Araba.
Lovely.
So I made comment to this a little bit in the last question, just about thinking about how, I guess, the research community and resource-based communities often do interact through co-designed or transdisciplinary research. And so there is an inequity there about, who has a say in what gets done. And I think, to me, properly structured co-design process is very cognizant of that and tries to work to reduce some of those inequities. I think another really important dimension of equity that's worth thinking about is when it comes to expertise. And this is something that a lot of co-design practices has been built to address and recognize just the importance and highly relevant information that can come from local communities about the places they live in. And a big problem, though, is the extraction of that information that often occurs in research practice. So research communities come in, they ask you, if you're working with a resource-based community, there's questions asked about, okay, what do you know about your local area? That information is taken, and it essentially is taken, out of the community only to the benefit of the research community, right? With nothing going into to support the resource-based community. That's another really big inequity. I think there's another aspect of that too, and it comes from how sometimes we talk about ocean literacy. So this is a big conversation that occurs in the ocean decade. And it's sometimes used as a way that kind of delegitimizes local communities and the knowledge they hold, because a lot of the time, so I work a lot in data poor systems, I work a lot in expert elicitation, and I can tell you if I'm doing a research project that's context focused, that's focused on a particular area, it's almost always the case that the more credible information comes from the resource users rather than credentialized scientists about those issues. So a lot of co-design is about recognizing expertise properly. But also, I would think recognizing, the benefits that come from that and how that's distributed. So just on the last bit, Araba, because you asked about, what can be done or how can co-design address, or how can the decade address co-design, I would say the one thing I would do, one of those questions, like if I had a magic wand and I could change one thing, would be kind of directed towards funding groups. So if there is anyone listening to this that's part of a funding institution, I think an amazing thing that could happen is if funding, some set of funding was given not to research communities, but to resource-based communities, which they can actually reach out to select researchers they want to work with. That would flip the power disparity on its head. It would help ensure that questions that resource-based communities are interested in, problems they're having addressed, get solved, or get addressed, at least get researched, and would help kind of validate the values they hold, right? So I think that would be one really powerful thing that can be done. And if we can't do that, I think it is worth really developing and promoting research models which kind of front end the kind of social sciences that explore values and problems that communities have, front end that, and have the more traditional ocean science that understands oceanographic processes come afterwards. Try to figure out the important aspects of the ocean science that contributes to the problem that communities face. And I say that as someone trained in ecology, not as social science. So I think that's it for me.
Anyone else to speak on either the link between co-design and equity, or how challenges can be addressed in the decade? Elisa.
Yeah, and thanks, just to say thanks to Jara for raising these points, which have also been very much felt in the One Ocean Hub. And nice to see your cat after mine jumped into our call earlier on in the webinar. I think, definitely, co-design is all about equity. And in fact, it's really about, first of all, understanding what are the existing inequities and in what ways, at the very least, we need to prevent contributing to reinforcing them or avoiding mistakes that have been done in the past. And I think one of the good practices in the One Ocean Hub has been to co-develop a code of practice where we capture the learning that some of our particularly social scientists had developed in their previous work around their understanding of the equity issues with the communities we were working with, but also some of the decision makers they had worked with, and the equity issues among previous research partnerships and among different the relationships between social sciences, between natural and social sciences, and between global scientists in the global north and the global south, and how that worked in the past and whether or not their relationship was fair. So I think really taking stock of what each of the researchers and partners have learned and understood about equity and inequity, and owning up to it by distilling it and developing a shared code of practice is a really important step, and something that I think as part of the young decade, we should all share if we have these tools and share the learning that comes from implementing those tools, but also very much share with donors and realize, I think the other experience that has been really important is that in the case of the One Ocean Hub, the UK Global Research Challenges Fund had already taken stock of what hadn't gone wrong in previous development funded research and had specific requirements for us as researchers in applying, improving how we would address equity issues. And I think having those conditions was really helpful and supported us in tackling some of the existing power imbalances, among researchers and with partners outside of academia. So that I think was fundamental. And the more we identify good practices by donors and then ask specifically others to follow suit or take similar approaches, I think the more we can all be supported in addressing those inequities. The other aspect is that equity and our understanding of equity evolves over time. As we are in a relationship, we may be able to address issues, but involuntarily or for a whole sets of reasons, give rise to new equity issues. And I think another thing that's important is both for us as researchers in co-designing and for donors to allow for flexibility, that opportunity to learn, to really monitor and understand how the relationships and any equity issues are evolving for better or worse, and being able to respond in a co-developed manner to those. And I think maybe the last piece is making time and resources for writing up about what we're learning about co-development, the methods, the mistakes, the models we're developing, even just like the human experiences we're all being part of, because I think that there's no other way, we all feel that we're kind of almost starting from scratch, and there's a lot of knowledge that we need to share and from, learn from one another if we want to make real progress moving forward. And just to give an example, I think what was really incredible for us in the One Ocean Hub was hearing about good practices, for instance, in terms of recognizing inequities in publication practices, both within academics at different stages of career, divided by lines of gender and class and race, and also the belonging to certain scientific disciplines. And the other experiences very varied and creative in terms of fairly sharing benefits with communities and other partners. And I think capturing those experiences and giving those ideas was really fruitful for other researchers who didn't have that exposure to think in those terms, maybe for the first time, about their own work.
Thank you. So we have maybe Hekia go next, Hekia or Anna. And while you're speaking, with apologies to whoever will be speaking at that particular time, Karine might share the results for poll number 3 so that we can activate poll number 4.
Thanks, Arva. I just wanted to comment briefly on something we haven't brought up yet in terms of advancing equity that potentially speaks to, Nathan just raised a question, Nathan Bett just raised a question in the chat, how do we address this issue that scientists are maybe least likely to or co-productions processes led by scientists are least likely to address shifts towards sustainability. And I haven't read the article, but I think, yeah, absolutely. This idea that if resource dependent communities can be the ones leading what research takes place and directing what research takes place, I think that has potential implications for those community members to then also be able to inform the governing processes that affect them. So inequity as being a result of an inability to inform the governing processes that affect you. And I think that one way communities can better do this is through questions or through the ownership of data or control, and not even just that the ownership and control is important, but being able to have the capacity to aggregate the information from scientific research projects that have been done in their area, right? So having the physical data, having the results from previous projects and ongoing projects available, so that, I mean, this is a specific case, again, up in the Arctic with the Inuit group I'm working with. They are trying to, develop a repository for all the research that's been done in their area and to hold that data so that they can then analyze what's been done and what hasn't been done to inform research going forward. So I think, yeah, the ability for community groups to inform what research should be done can be in part facilitated by, and potentially this is a way, funding agencies might support co-design going forward, but funding for community groups to have the capacity to aggregate their data. So the administrative support to do that.
Thank you, Hekia. And as you can see, we're interrupting a little bit with the results for question number 3. And we're going to wrap our conversation up now with Annette and Anna. And so maybe Annette, you can share your views on the link between co-design and equity, and then perhaps Anna can focus on how co-design challenges be addressed in the decade.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's hard to add to all these to great points without being repetitive. So I kind of I endorse. No, I kind of would repeat a lot of the things, and I'm not going to do that. So maybe just one thing that that I found striking when I read a book by Max Libaron recently on pollution is colonialism, is there's this, and that I reflected on this entitlement that scientists and science still assumes to have access to land and people to get data. And even though, of course, I know also about the colonial legacy of anthropology and so have been reflective of this myself. Still, I kind of realized when I wanted to do research in Scotland, that people said no to me. No, we're not going to have you do research here. And I was like, hey, this is, I have never encountered this before, and this hasn't happened to me in Indonesia, but that says something about maybe also the power relationship that's involved when I do research in Indonesia. So just some reflections that I think that co-design really also have something to do with the power of communities to say no, to have their lands and their lives being subjected to science. If it's not in their benefit, it does not make sense to them. And so, just my personal reflection on this to add. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. That's a really great point. And finally, Anna, maybe for a minute or so, so that we can quickly go to Harriet to wrap up. So Anna, your views on how co-design challenges can be addressed in the decade.
Sounds great. And so very briefly, again, I mean, I don't have anything major to add to what everyone has already said. I guess 2 questions that leave me, and in true postmodern training of mine. So thinking about, it all depends. I really think it's so hard to make major generalizations about what's right, what's wrong. I mean, not ultimately, but it can really depend on the person and the individual, whether you're an academic, right? Whatever position you hold, right? Going back to those core elements of empathy, compassion, respect, and how we approach things, and acknowledging, right, as Annette said, sometimes maybe you just have to step back. And the community, definitely community issues of power within the community. But so I guess the questions to me that remain in terms of co-design is, how do we hold people accountable, regardless of what position they hold, regardless of the position of power? And then the second thing in terms of equity is, what do we mean by equity, and how do we measure that equity? Because it's clearly the super important term that's been just everywhere recently. And then, so how do we actually measure it, and how do we know we've succeeded? Have we succeeded, right? Is it this iterative process that just keeps going and going and going, and we keep trying to improve? And yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thanks to all our panelists for your really, really excellent and thought-provoking points. I am sorry that we had to rush you a little bit towards the end, but as Harriet said, this is the beginning of a conversation, and we're hoping to have many more to come. I will hand over now to Harriet to wrap things up for us.
Thank you so much, Rava, and thank you very much, Corinne, for anticipating. What an absolutely wonderful panel. Anna, Annette, Elisa, Gerald, and Hekia, thank you so much for sharing your reflections. We're going to have lots of fun writing up a little reflections piece after this discussion. I hope that my keynotes are going to do justice to the points. Araba, thank you so much for guiding our panelists through the questions. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Karen, Constance, and the team for making this possible, and a huge thanks to the audience for being with us today. As Araba mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, this is the start of further conversations on this and further interactive panels and areas where hopefully we can hear more from you. If you'd like to be part of further conversations, you'll see an email coming from the team in the next day or so to follow up, and we'd love to hear from you. So on that note, let me just say thank you so much. I'm going to give you all a round of applause here and I wish everyone a really lovely rest of their days wherever you are in the world. Thanks everyone, and goodbye.